The screen door was still swinging when Delia Fontenot disappeared. On the evening of June 3, 1965, in the parish town of Opelousas, Louisiana, population 17,200, the air sat thick and close the way it always did in early June, bayou humid, smelling of jasmine and standing water, and the faint sweetness of sugarcane from the processing plant south of town. At 7:08 p.m., Delia's next-door neighbor, a retired postal worker named Curtis Thibodeau, watched from his front porch as the 28-year-old schoolteacher walked out her side door in her yellow Sunday dress, a covered dish in both hands, headed 3 blocks down Champaign Street to the church hall potluck supper. He raised his hand. She raised one finger off the dish, a kind of half-wave, and smiled at him. He never saw her again. That is not a story about a woman who got lost on a 3-block walk she had made 100 times. That is a story about a man who had been watching her make that walk. And waiting. And it would take 57 years, one retired sheriff's investigator, and a tobacco tin recovered from a storm drainage culvert that had been sealed under a parish road since 1967 to finally bring her case to light. But before we get to any of that, we have to go back to Opelousas, because to understand what was lost, you first have to understand who Delia Fontenot was. Opelousas, in 1965, was the kind of Louisiana town that measured itself in Sundays. Sunday Mass at St. Landry Catholic, Sunday dinner at whoever's table had room, Sunday evenings on the front porch with a glass of sweet tea watching the fireflies come up out of the grass. The town sat in the heart of St. Landry Parish, surrounded by flat rice fields and crawfish ponds, and stands of live oak draped in Spanish moss so heavy it darkened the roads at midday. People had lived in Opelousas for generations. Family names appeared on storefronts and on church pews and on the deed records at the courthouse, going back 150 years. And that kind of continuity created a place where trust was the default condition, where a woman could walk 3 blocks alone at dusk and have no reason to feel afraid. Delia had grown up 12 miles away in Eunice and had come to Opelousas 4 years earlier to take a position teaching 3rd grade at Bellevue Elementary. She rented the small white house on Champaign Street, kept a kitchen garden of tomatoes and snap beans along the back fence, and had become, in the way that beloved teachers do, a kind of second mother to half the children in her classroom. She was the 3rd of 6 children, the daughter of a sugarcane farmer named Octave Fontenot and a seamstress named Marie Claire, and she drove the 40-minute round trip to Eunice every Sunday after Mass to have dinner at her parents' table. She had a younger brother, Ren, who was 16 in the summer of 1965, and who looked up to her with the particular intensity of a boy who was still figuring out who he wanted to be. She had a habit of reading on her front porch after supper with a glass of iced chicory coffee, a practice that had made her a fixture of the neighborhood, familiar enough that people looked for her the way you look for something you expect to see and only notice when it's gone. She had told her mother on the phone the night before that she had finally decided to enroll in a summer graduate program at USL in Lafayette that fall. She was going to get her full teaching certification. That was the last conversation Marie Claire Fontenot ever had with her daughter. At 8:45 p.m., the organizer of the St. Landry Parish Hall potluck called the home of the church secretary to ask if anyone had heard from Delia Fontenot. The covered dish had never arrived. At 9:10 p.m., the secretary drove down Champaign Street and found Delia's side door standing open and the porch light on. At 9:30 p.m., Curtis Thibodeau called the St. Landry Parish Sheriff's Office. Deputies arrived within 15 minutes. The side door of Delia's house showed no sign of forced entry. Her pocketbook was on the kitchen table. Her car, a 1959 Chevrolet Bel Air in pale green, sat in the driveway undisturbed. A deputy walking the route between her house and the church hall found the covered dish, a ceramic casserole, its foil wrapping still tight, lying in the grass on the far side of the chain-link fence that bordered the alley behind the Turode property on Vine Street, less than half a block from her door. The dish had not shattered. It had been set down, or dropped cleanly. Beside it, pressed into the soft summer earth, were two distinct shoe impressions. One woman's low heel, one larger, flat-soled, male. The impressions were photographed. The casserole was taken into evidence. Delia Fontenot was gone. By morning, the parish had organized. Men worked the drainage ditches and the bayou channels south of town. Women sat with Marie Claire and Octave, who had driven in from Eunice in the dark, arriving at the Champagne Street house before 4 a.m, to stand in a kitchen that still smelled like their daughter. Wren drove every street in Opelousas twice before sunrise, and then drove them again. They found nothing. Nothing. Except for one thing. A deputy working a drainage culvert on Marcotte Road, a quarter-mile east of the church hall, noticed that the culvert's metal access cap, a utility cover bolted into the parish road surface, appeared recently disturbed. The bolt was scratched. Recently, he noted it in his report. The sheriff's investigator who reviewed the report decided it was unrelated. It was not unrelated. The lead investigator assigned to the case was Chief Deputy Investigator Harlan Boudreau of the St. Landry Parish Sheriff's Office, a 44-year-old Creole man who had worked St. Landry Parish law enforcement for 19 years, and who understood, as a matter of professional conviction, that when a woman vanished on a 3-block walk in a town where she was known by everyone, the answer was almost always in the nearest circle. He interviewed 41 people in the first 10 days. He reconstructed the route 3 times at dusk, the same light level, the same time of evening, trying to understand what could have happened in the space of 3 blocks in 30 minutes. 2 men drew his attention. The first was a man named Albert Savoy, 34, who had reportedly made unwelcome approaches to Delia at a parish fish fry the previous Easter. 3 witnesses confirmed the incident. 2 said Delia had been visibly uncomfortable. Boudreau interviewed Savoy 4 times. Savoy's alibi placed him at a barroom in Ville Platte, 40 miles away, from 6 in the evening onward, confirmed by the bartender and 5 other men who knew him well. He was eliminated. The second name came from a single line in a neighborhood canvass conducted by a junior deputy. A woman named Ella Mae Saunier, who lived on Vine Street 3 doors from the alley where the casserole was found, told the deputy that a man named Gerald Arsenault, a 36-year-old pipefitter who rented a room in a boarding house on Market Street, had been seen twice in the week before Delia's disappearance, standing near the fence line of the alley, doing nothing in particular, watching the street. The deputy wrote it down. Boudreau reviewed it. Arsenault was interviewed once, briefly, and told deputies he had been walking home from work. No one followed the thread further. Boudreau had a reason for not pressing it at the time. It wasn't a good reason. The office had 6 open cases, 2 of them violent, and the political pressure from the parish council to resolve them had compressed everything else. He would spend 30 years being unable to fully forgive himself for that compression. Meanwhile, Octave Fontenot drove to the sheriff's office every Monday for 11 weeks, not to demand anything, just to be seen, to make sure no one in that building forgot his daughter's name. Marie Claire kept the phone by her bed, ringed, turned up, for 4 years. Wren enlisted in the Army in 1967. He told his recruiter he needed to go somewhere where things made sense. By the end of 1965, the active investigation had reached its first dead end. The casserole dish had no latent prints of value. The shoe impressions had been photographed but not cast. Boudreau's legal pad had questions down both margins. The case did not close. Nothing in St. Landry Parish ever closed that had a family still standing in front of it. By 1970, 5 years had passed. The White House on Champagne Street had a new tenant, a young couple with 2 small children, and the kitchen garden along the back fence had been dug up for a swing set. Curtis Thibodeau still sat on his front porch in the evenings. He had told every person who asked, and some who hadn't, exactly what he had seen at 7:08 p.m. On June 3, 1965. He was not going to let that moment become uncertain in his memory. It was the only thing he could do for her. By 1978, Harlan Boudreau had been made sheriff. His first act was to pull the Fontenot file and have it reclassified as an active open investigation, which gave it resources and documentation standards a cold case would not otherwise receive. It was a bureaucratic gesture, but it kept the file from being boxed and warehoused. By 1985, Boudreau had retired. He took nothing from his office when he left except the Fontenot case file and a cardboard box of associated records. He drove them to his house on Prudhomme Street in Opelousas and put them in the back bedroom he used as a study. Gerald Arsenault's name was circled on page 7 of the original neighborhood canvas. It had been circled since 1971. By 1993, Octave Fontenot had died. Marie Claire followed in 1998. Ren, who had come back from Vietnam and built a life in Baton Rouge as a high school history teacher, drove to Opelousas every June 3rd and left flowers at the spot in the alley behind Vine Street where the casserole dish had been found. The flowers were always yellow. Delia had been wearing yellow. The entry in the St. Landry Parish Missing Persons Registry still listed her status as open. A clerk updated the date field every year. It was the only way the system had of keeping faith with the missing. Then, in the summer of 2022, something changed that no one had seen coming. Every case on this channel represents weeks of research, verifying facts, and piecing together real lives that were lost. If you want us to keep uncovering the truth behind stories like this one, please take a second to like this video, subscribe, and drop a comment telling us where in the world you're watching from. Your support is what makes this possible. Now, let's get back to Delia. In July of 2022, a St. Landry Parish road crew was relining the drainage culverts along Marcotte Road in preparation for a parish-wide infrastructure update. When they removed the access cap from the culvert a quarter-mile east of the church hall, the same culvert a deputy had noted in a 1965 report, the crew chief found, lodged in the upper curve of the pipe against the concrete collar. A small circular tin. It was corroded and sealed with rust. The crew chief, a 51-year-old man named Darren Metoyer, who had grown up in Opelousas and knew the Fontenot case the way everyone his age knew it, did not touch the tin. He called the parish sheriff's office. The St. Landry Parish Cold Case Unit arrived within the hour. Inside the tobacco tin, a Prince Albert tobacco tin, standard issue for the era, the kind sold at every gas station and general store in Louisiana in 1965, investigators found 2 items wrapped in a piece of oilcloth that had preserved them against 5 decades of moisture. The first was a woman's single pearl earring, plain white, post back. The second was a folded piece of lined notebook paper, handwritten, which investigators believe Delia may have been forced to write as a form of control, and which has never been made public in full, but which named a location. The oilcloth bore a partial palm print. The print was run through the Louisiana State Police automated fingerprint identification system. It returned a match in 48 hours. Gerald Arsenault. The palm print matched a set of impressions taken from Arsenault in 1974, when he had been fingerprinted as part of a background check for a pipefitters union job in Lake Charles. The print had existed in the system for 48 years. It had never been compared to anything connected to the Fontenot case, because there had been nothing in the Fontenot case with a recoverable print, until the tin came out of the culvert. The cold case supervisor called Harlan Boudreau at his house on Prudhomme Street. Boudreau was 101 years old. He had been in the same study where the case file lived for more than 3 decades, though his eyesight no longer permitted him to read it. He listened on the phone for a long time without speaking. Then he said, "Arsenault, Page 7. Yes, sir, the supervisor said. Page 7. Gerald Arsenault had not stayed in Opelousas. He had moved to Lake Charles in 1967, then to Shreveport in 1974, then to a mobile home park outside of Baton Rouge in 1981, where he lived quietly and without incident for the next 4 decades. He worked pipe-fitting jobs on and off, collected a small pension, drove a pickup truck, and attended no church. He had no close friends that investigators could identify. He had never married. He was 93 years old when the St. Landry Parish Sheriff's Office and the Louisiana State Police Cold Case Unit drove to the mobile home park outside Baton Rouge in October of 2022 and arrested him at his kitchen table. He did not appear shocked. A neighbor who witnessed the arrest from across the road described him as very still, the way a man is still when he has been waiting for something for a very long time and has finally run out of road. He was transported to St. Landry Parish in a sheriff's unit, booked on charges of second-degree murder, and remanded without bail on account of flight risk assessment and the weight of the evidence. His attorney entered a not guilty plea. In March of 2023, facing a forensic print match, the recovered tin, and a location indicated in the notebook paper that had allowed investigators to find partial skeletal remains in a dry stream on the western edge of the parish, Gerald Arsenault changed his plea to guilty. He was sentenced to life in prison. He was taken from the courtroom in a wheelchair. The people of Opelousas received the news the way a community receives something it is expected and dreaded and needed all at once. Former students of Delia Fontenot, now in their 60s and 70s, gathered outside the St. Landry Parish Courthouse. Ren Fontenot, 73 years old, stood at the top of the courthouse steps and did not speak for a long time, and when he did, he said only that he wished his parents had lived to see it. He said they had deserved to see it more than anyone. Members of the First Baptist congregation on Court Street, the Methodist Women's Circle, the Bellevue Elementary Parent Community, the men and women who had organized the search in June of 1965, all processed the same revelation. Gerald Arsenault had lived in their town. He had walked the same streets. He had watched Delia make that 3-block walk and calculated something that no one who saw him on the street would have guessed him capable of calculating. Because he had looked, as people who do terrible things so often look, like nothing at all. Ella Mae Saunier, who had told a deputy in 1965 that she had seen a man standing near the alley fence and watching the street, had died in 1988. She had known something was wrong. She had said so. Someone had written it down, and the writing had mattered, and it had taken 57 years for the system to catch up with what she had seen. Ren Fontenot drove to Opelousas on June 3, 2023, as he had every year since his sister disappeared. He brought yellow flowers. He stood in the alley behind Vine Street for a while, in the summer heat, in the humidity that smells of jasmine and sugarcane the way it always has, the way it always will. Then he drove to the small white house on Champaign Street, different tenants now. A family with young children who had been told what the house was and had agreed without hesitation, and he sat on the front porch where Curtis Thibodeau used to sit and watch the street. He said later that he stayed until the fireflies came up out of the grass. Delia Fontenot was 28 years old. She taught 3rd grade. She kept a kitchen garden of tomatoes and snap beans. She drove 40 minutes every Sunday to have dinner at her parents' table. She was going to get her full teaching certification. She raised one finger off a covered dish to wave at a neighbor and walked into the summer evening and the life she was building. The classroom, the graduate program, the Sunday dinners, the porch, and the chicory coffee was taken from her before she made it half a block. Her remains were brought home to Eunice in the winter of 2022 and buried in the Fontenot family plot beside her parents. The headstone was chosen by Ren. It says her name, her years, and one line below. She was loved by every child she ever taught. What do we owe to the LMA Sauniers of the world, the ordinary people who saw something true and said so, whose words sat in a file for half a century until someone finally had a reason to act on them? What does it mean that a tobacco tin and a drainage culvert preserved the evidence that a system could not? And what does justice look really, when it arrives in a wheelchair, 57 years late, to a man who had lived a full and unbothered life while a family drove to Opelousas every June and left yellow flowers in an alley? Justice found Delia Fontenot after 57 years. Stories like hers are why this channel exists. If you believe the truth is worth pursuing no matter how long it takes, subscribe so you don't miss the next case. More cases are waiting in the description below. Thank you for being here.